And I think that's what I think is kind of crazy to me, is that most companies think that business is about numbers, right? Your revenue, your EPS, your monthly run rate, your subscription rate, whatever. But numbers don't buy growth. Belief does. And what I mean by that is belief is contagious. It spreads faster than features, it compounds faster than revenue. And so that's the difference, I think, between companies that stall and companies that really, tip the world. It's not talent. It's not the capital. It's not the timing. It's, did they create belief in the market? Internally, you got to build it inside the walls of the company, but also in the market. And so I think that's really one of the most powerful forces in business, because once people believe, I think everything changes. And I think a lot of companies don't get there.
Okay, we are live. Well, welcome to Thrivecast. I think this is our episode 86 or 87, depends on how you count it. And today we're going to talk about one of the biggest blind spots in innovation. With me, I have Holly Miller, who's the founder and president for Gray Matter Marketing. She works at an intersection of strategy, messaging, and market behavior. That's pretty unique from many aspects. Most of our listeners, if you're a growth marketer, this probably would be a great place for you to know why great products fail to drive adoption. So in this conversation, we're going to touch upon two or three ideas. The first one is, the intersection of marketing and product. What drives adoption behaviors? What's the typical market belief? And with me, I'll have maybe Holly talk a little more about herself, and we'll take it from there. Holly.
Hello, I'm so happy to be here, Guru. Thank you so much for the invitation. I've really always enjoyed your podcast. I feel like every time I listen, I hear something that's very insightful, but also actionable. So I'm hoping I can pay that forward today in this episode.
Absolutely. We have about 80,000 plus our listeners across different channels. So, and this is one of the topics that's probably near and dear to most of them. Maybe let's start with the first one. I'm so excited, Holly. I think you write a lot of great articles, and even during our pre-conversation, you mentioned about you're very focused about product adoption is a big problem, and it seems that you might be thinking about it a lot more than I have been. So I'm very curious today. So I'm going to start off with maybe taking us back about 5 to 10 years back. Building SaaS companies was a lot more easier. You would build it and assume over a period of time they will come. And looks like what you have been now saying very recently, at least I've been reading your content a little more recently, is that that's a myth, that you build it and they will come. That's probably 5 years, 10 years past, right? So tell us a little more what's happening today in the market.
100%. And I love that you opened with that, because I think it's a wonderful movie, right? Field of Dreams, but it's a terrible business philosophy. And I think the idea is, most companies assume I'm just going to build a better product, and the market will automatically want it, right? It's very logical. And often because we're very close to it. It's like a person who has a baby. They think their baby's beautiful, right? Even if it maybe, isn't. And so I think most product failures happen because the adoption does not occur, not because of the product performance. And I actually come from a healthcare background. I've been in the medical device and drug industry for about 30 years now. And in that space, 2 out of 3 products fail for this reason. And I think SaaS sees the same dynamic playing out even faster. And so I think about it as success is really tied to helping the market understand why changing now matters. And so, why should they care about you? How are you going to change their life? Why should you stop, using product X and start using product Y? And that's really, I think, what drives business performance. And I think you had mentioned that you can't create, well, let me back up. You had mentioned that if a company is onboarding a new SaaS product and they think it should take 15 minutes, and if it takes 3 weeks, guess what? You've just created a new problem with the solution that you think is better, right? And so the idea is you can't create new problems. You have to really find something that people matter, cares to them deeply. And that's what really drives adoption. And that is what actually drives your revenue, your market leadership. Otherwise, you're just one of many who's kind of creating friction in the marketplace and no one cares.
Yeah, I think to all the listeners, we had a blog post out about a week or so back where, Holly was nice, nice to read that and then give us a little bit of comments on that. We had talked to almost about 68 or 69 or SaaS companies at that time, and most of them, they had an amazing marketing team. They would bring in the visitors, they would get them to sign up, but customers could not find the value in the first maybe even a day or 2 or 3 days. So some of our previous podcast guests, they talked about how to drive activation of your product after the moment they have signed up. You only have about 10 or 15 minutes to get their attention, and this is typically for a product led or a B2C kind of a product. And if you don't provide that value within that first 10 15 minutes, and that's stretching, typically it's about 1 to maybe even 3 minutes, almost 95 98% of them drop off. They won't even come back. And Holly, I think what you're mentioning is in the healthcare space, 2 out of 3, that's about 25% or maybe even 33% of the customers actually stay put. In the SaaS world, it's a lot more brutal. I think almost 96 97% of them don't come back, even after sign up.
Yeah. It's an
So
interesting
it's
point because I think what people fail to recognize is that how fast your company scales, how your revenue scales is directly dependent on how fast you can get the market to change their behavior. And I think that's the fundamental disconnect. I don't care what industry you're in. We are as human beings, I don't care if you're a rocket scientist or a teenager, the human brain is exactly the same and we are resistant to change. We actually protect the status quo. And so to get people to do something different, to get them to switch is actually very, very difficult. And so my thought is like, that's not just, the bed you're making. It's an opportunity to really understand how do we accelerate that adoption. And it really comes down to something that sounds very simple, which is what's the right problem you're going to solve and who's the right audience. If you can't answer those two things very quickly, then to your point, the market's just not motivated to make a change. You're not giving them any reason to do something differently. And if they can't see your value instantly, they're just going to move on. And it's very hard to get them back, to your point. It's very hard to get them back if they have a bad
yeah,
experience or a low value experience.
yeah. So Holly, you mentioned two things, right? Who's your audience and what problems do they have? Could you maybe double down a little bit about maybe the second part of it? I think who's the audience, we'll touch upon that a little bit because in a B2B context, in a B2C context, the user and the buyer are typically slightly different, right? We'll come back to that a little bit. Could you touch up a little about the problem do they have? Are they searching for the problems? That's how they land to your website? Or how do you see the question about problem framing comes on your website and your marketing conversations?
Thank you for that question because it's such a smart one to ask. And the reason is because there's not just one answer, there's actually two. And I'll give you an example. You can either be an audience segment that is experiencing a problem very acutely and are indeed actively seeking that out,
Hmm.
or you could be an audience that's uneducated about a problem, mainly because you just accept it. That's the way it is. So a good example might be Uber. Generally speaking, no one liked taxis. Like it just was, no one was going to die on the sword for how great taxis are. So
Yeah.
Uber recognized that. So people already kind of wanted it, they were looking for something better. They didn't know what, rideshare was, but they were actively disgusted by taxis. Airbnb, on the other hand, hotels were not in a crisis, right? Hotels were fine. Airbnb found a different problem to solve for a specific audience. Initially, the Airbnb were, some young guys that needed to pay their rent. And so they had an extra sofa. So it was literally like, here's a mattress, you can stay here the night. That problem has evolved to kind of like live like a local, right? When you travel. So I think in that case, people didn't realize they had a problem with hotels. So you can have either one. But I think the way we look at it and we try to help our clients think about it is you have a grid. It's a 4 quadrant grid. You've got in your top right, you've got delighters and nice to have annoyances, and then on the top left, disgusters. Additionally, when people say, where do you want to be on this 4 quadrant, grid, you want to say, I want to be in the upper right, right? I want to delight my customers. That's what's going to make them loyal to me or even switch. But what companies get wrong is that the delighting facts are not what actually creates advocates and loyalists. It's the disgusters. If you can solve a disguster, that will make someone loyal, but will also make them switch. Most companies never focus on that and they never get to that. They think if they just delight the customer, that's enough. An example I will give you, and it's audience dependent. This is important.
Hmm.
Not everyone's going to have the same problem the same way, right? The same level of acuity. So if you think about, I fly a lot, and so if I get a free upgrade, that's going to delight me, right? I'm, president of a company. I have a very, busy schedule. I need everything to be working on time, right? I can't have delays or cancellations. So you're going to delight me with a free upgrade. But if you cancel my flight, guess what? That really throws a wrench in my life, right? You do it enough, United, and I'm going to switch to Delta. Conversely, though, if I'm a college student and the flight's full and a president or a CEO has to get on a flight, they might offer, $1,000 flight credit or something, right? If I'm a college student, I might think that's amazing, right? I might be like, yeah, that's great. And so a canceled flight is a disguster for the CEO, but it's not a disguster for the college student. So you
Yeah.
really have to hone in on what is the disguster you can solve and for which audience that's really having that most acutely.
Yeah, and this reminds me of almost about 8 to 9 months back. I met Rory Sutherland, I think the patron for Ogilvy and Mather, one of the largest marketing companies. And he had just finished a talk, and I had a sit down discussion with him. And I told him, hey, one or two things. Could you tell me a little more about? He worked on an airline with an airline company that was, I'm not sure whether it was Spirit or some other company, very cheap, you know, uh, airfares. They added, instead of raising the price, they were focusing on essentially booking all the seats. And they could not even get 70, 80% of the fill rate for the airline. So they just added, kind of a phone holder, a very cheap, 10 cent, 20-cent phone holder that you can attach to the front of your this thing, and it's already attached. And they suddenly saw within 2 months or so, youngsters, interns, college students, pretty much book 100% of the flights, and they were getting overbooked. Just the simple 10 cents, 15-cent disguster, because most of those you had to go buy one, or there's no way for you to even keep the phone there.
Yeah,
So
and to
I
your
think,
point, when that problem is undeniable and the audience is precise, then adoption feels very automatic, right? It feels very natural. It feels very organic. I read somewhere that the cup holder in a car is one of the most valuable attributes in a car that people look for. And again, it's one of those things like you want it. You just want it, you know?
yeah, until Audi and Volkswagen, they added the cup holder. Their sales in US was very, very low. I think about 8, 10 years back, they added that, and they added one for the passenger, one for the driver's seats, and one for the back as well. Their sales have zoomed past. So you're absolutely right. Finding the right disgust and finding the right pain for the specific audience is key. Maybe this is aside to the conversation, but how does one find these discuss and these pains? If you were a marketing person for a SaaS company or for a healthcare company, what do you typically advise SaaS founders or growth leaders? How do you go find this particular pain or discuss, if you will?
Well, it's a great question. And I think there's one flaw that a lot of companies do. They make a product first and they try to figure out how do we sell this to people, right? They don't even know what the problem is. They just think, okay, this is cool. Let's go sell this and figure out who wants this, which is absolutely upside down. So I always say, one, find the problem. To your point, how do you find it? I think there's one very important answer, which is listen. Listen to the customer. The deeper the customer intimacy you have, I think the more insights you will uncover. And you can't really do it in like a quantitative market research, like, hey, do you want a cup holder or not? It's really listening. How are people describing things? What keeps them up at night? If you already have a product, why does someone use it? Why did they buy it? What was the use case scenario? Like all these things, really understanding the art behind what you're selling. Most people aren't buying a product, they're actually buying what that product unlocks for them. It's a very emotional experience. So I think you have to really understand, what if you could fix that one thing, how would that transform their life? They're the hero of the story. And I think a lot of times companies are constrained by, well, this is how it is. So I have to work within this box versus really finding something new and different that pushes the realm. So I'll just give you a quick example in healthcare because it's easy for me. But a lot of times when patients had to have their vitals monitored, they would make you go to the hospital and you had to get hooked up to all sorts of devices to monitor your heart rate and your blood pressure and all these different things. Why we have the technology to monitor. You have an Apple Watch, and like we can monitor things outside of the hospital. And really COVID made people realize there's a different way.
Hmm.
A lot of people have type 2 diabetes. They have to prick their finger to text, to test their blood. Why? Why is there not a better
Yeah.
way to check your blood sugar? Now we have continuous glucose monitors. So I think there's two things. One is really spend time to understand what your customers are going through, and two, do not be constrained by what I call the premise of like, this is how it has to be. This is how it always is. That's showbiz. The real innovation comes from asking why. Why?
Yeah, the first principles thinking looks like that's what you're alluding to, Holly. I think that is great. You know, I'm going to take a slightly different stand, right? And let's see whether I really understand your value proposition there by going on the other side and see whether that it makes sense. Most SaaS founders, most growth leaders, most builders, they think they inherently understand the problem. They think, because they have experienced some pain in the past, and they might have a story behind it, or they might have some painful incident because of which they say, hey, I'm going to go solve this particular problem, but they're not able to articulate what that specific pain was. They start building a solution, and then they feel extremely indoctrinated themselves that, hey, this is probably a problem that has happened to me and I'm a very common man, very likely it's going to happen to others as well. So they focus on the solution, so they assume that most people understand the problem, which is why they spend most of the time in the solution, because the solution is a differentiating factor for them. But I'll give some examples. Maybe I'll even ask you questions. Holly, what do you think? How many CRMs are there in the market? The customer relationship management tools, which allow you to have conversations with customers. How many CRMs out there might be there in the market?
A dozen? I don't know.
Okay, it's about 700 plus.
Okay, I'm like, it's probably a lot. Yeah.
Right, it's a lot, and every single one that you talk to, they only talk about the differentiating factor of how they're different than Salesforce or HubSpot, or it's always about the solution. It's always about the differentiating factors. It's never really about what problem they're trying to solve, because inherently I think most of them believe that people automatically understand what the problem are and they're coming for a solution, whereas what you are saying is exactly the opposite. People are searching for the problem, and they may not necessarily be searching for a very specific solution. They are saying, hey, I have this particular problem, how do I go solve it? And there could be 3 or 4 solutions out there in the market, maybe hundreds of them, and the decider of which solution is appropriate for their problem used to be, at least 6 years back, used to be the sales guys trying to convince them that you have this problem and this is our solution to go solve that. But today I think it has reversed quite a bit. Would that be the right assumption?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because it really it goes back to how our brains work. Again, doesn't matter if you're, a CEO, the toddler, doesn't make a difference. Our brains work the same way. And that is that our brains are actually quite lazy. And so when you think about if you've ever gone to eat at the Cheesecake Factory, they give you the menu and it's like an encyclopedia, right? It's got like hundreds and hundreds of pages. And our brain doesn't like that, which is why we often ask the waiter or waitress or server, what do you recommend? Right? Like we want a shortcut. Our brains want laziness. And so when we are presented with something new, our brain makes a mental shortcut and it puts it into categories. The three categories, there's only three. It's must have, nice to have, or not interested. And the interesting thing is that going back to the Cheesecake Factory, the more options you have, the less your brain wants to do the work, right? And so that's why a lot of times, like you'll just stick with what you have, or someone has to make a case to you that it's going to solve a problem either that you accepted and didn't think it could change, maybe a problem you hadn't considered, or something you're actively looking for. But if you cannot become the most urgent and relevant solution to a problem someone already has, then they're not going to change their behavior. And so I think the more we understand how people's brains work, the more, again, success you'll have on getting them to change their behavior. And that's what really drives revenue. To your point, though, when someone is I think this idea of it's gonna be obvious when I put my product into the market, they're just gonna get it, right? Like it's gonna be obvious. The truth is, we as developers or companies, innovators, we actually are too familiar with the product. We're too familiar with everything. It just seems so obvious to us, and they skip the step of teaching the market. Hey, here's what's really missing. Wouldn't this be amazing if you could change that? Oh, guess what? By the way, we're the only one that does that. If you're not the only one, honestly, then you just become another option and you're just competing on prices or features that don't matter. And, I give an example of I love pizza. But if you're going to debate who has the best pizza, right? Like it's very personal, it's very emotional. There's no definitive answer. But if someone says, do you want to have sushi tonight or do you want to have pizza tonight? You're going to force a choice, right? Not a comparison. And that's what you really want to do in the market is to make your solution or your option the only one that makes sense for that particular audience and for that
Yeah.
particular problem.
Yeah. I think that makes perfect sense. I'm going to go maybe one step further. You did mention about drawing the attention to the problem and not so much of the solution. I think that's where we started from. We touched a little bit about the founders being too familiar, with their own product, their own solution. They don't put out the actual problem even on their websites. Their homepages don't really talk about the problem, and most of the time it's just talking about the solution. Maybe that's something to fix. Could you touch a little bit about, um, you know, uh, what does the word adoption mean? You've been writing profusely on the concept of adoption. What does adoption mean? Is it someone who's use? Is it usage? Is it changing their own behavior to use your product? What does it mean to you?
I love that question because it's quite an esoteric one. So I hope I can do it justice. But I think in the business world, I think adoption has very specific KPIs, right? It might be, number of customers. It could be, average recurring revenue on a monthly basis. It could be, lifetime value. There's some very like logical, rational metrics that I think companies use and highlight. And frankly, a lot of shareholders and board members expect to see those metrics, right? But when you really think about adoption, I think it's really about creating a rallying cry that people are passionate about. And
I
so
love
a
it.
good example, I'm old. And so in the 80s, they called the Pepsi challenge, which was Pepsi did a blind taste test against Coke and asked people to pick which one they liked better. I'm a big, like, I drink Coca-Cola every morning. I don't drink coffee. I don't drink tea, just regular straight up Coca-Cola, not even diet. So I love Coke. And I couldn't wait to to take this taste test because I knew for sure I was going to pick Coke. Guess what I picked?
Pick Pepsi, I guess.
Pepsi.
Yeah.
Do you think I changed what I drink? Absolutely not. I just stayed at a Marriott. They are a PepsiCo, hotel. And I'm always like, I will walk outside to find a CVS to go buy a Coke. That's
Yeah.
how it is. And so what you're really trying to do is to create this, you want to become like a rebel with a cause as a company. You want to have people become evangelists and adopt your doctrine, adopt your technology so that even if someone gave them a better deal, a better rate, offer them something, you would still
They would
reject
not
it.
go. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think that's what I really think is the, the North Star. That's the golden, ticket for most companies is you want to create those advocates. And I think the interesting thing is companies really mistake this. I think they believe that preference is the same thing as adoption. It's not really. If you can be substituted and people really kind of get the same thing, you haven't really created advocates. And so, for instance, in spine surgery, if you're getting a spinal fusion, people have heard of this. You need what's called a bone graft. You need something to basically help your bones grow back when they add hardware to like fuse your two vertebrae together. There are 350 bone growth product options. No company has the market. If a certain product were taken off the market, even if that was my preference, would I stop doing spine surgery? No, right? I would just substitute for something else. I'd be bummed maybe that my, product wasn't the one that was available to me, but I could still work without it. And I think that's what people have to understand is that you really have to create a solution and unlock value that really no one else can do. That's the goal. I'm not saying you can maintain that, but that is the goal.
Okay, I think that's what you would refer as adoption. So, maybe Holly, could you maybe share a little more insights on the push versus the pull, right? I know you mentioned a little about you can create the movement, you can bring in that massive adoption curve. If there's a movement, if there's a belief system that you can build into your audience, and you know, they if they start using it, they don't want to go away. But how do you start getting them to use it in the very first place? That's question number one. And question number two, how do you make them come back over and over again?
Yeah, I make it sound so easy, don't I? It's not that easy, really. I think the first thing goes back to who is your audience, right? And then I think that the idea is how do you, intersect with them? I think I use that word very intentionally,
Yeah.
intersect with them. Yes, there are some things where you can just be, online Googling, I'm actively searching for X. And maybe I'll see, a Google ad maybe for something or, something on my, my generative AI platform of choice. I'm kind of being fed this information. I'm being, led to this solution. And maybe that's fine. But I think for a pair of shoes or, a shirt or something, but for, business decisions, sometimes you need more than that. And I think it goes back to having that intimacy of knowing how are these people influenced? Is there a certain, is there a person that, if they heard me talk about it, they would, think this is legitimate? Is it a certain venue? Salesforce has Dreamforce every year, these kind of venues. So I think it's this idea of like, where do you find those people? And then how do you intersect with them? The thing that I think people get wrong, though, a lot of times is they lead with data. They say, we are 10% faster than this company, right? Or 10% cheaper than this company. And they lead with the data because they think that is going to be the rational reason someone
Mm,
makes a change.
okay.
It's actually not, though. People need to have the reason, and it's emotional. They then justify it with the rational. So you need both. But that data is what gives them conviction to stand behind their belief. And so there's a great quote by, he was a Harvard Business School professor named Theodore Levitt, and he famously said, people don't want to buy a quarter-inch drill. They want to buy a quarter-inch hole.
Oh,
And
yeah.
and what that means is that, like, they don't really care what tool they're using. They just need to hang a picture up on the wall, right? So they need that hole. And I read somewhere that I think a power drill is only used, I think, 13 minutes in its entire lifetime. But like when you need it, like you need it. And so I think this idea is understanding what the job is the customer needs, and then really trying to educate them and intersect with them about what they're wanting, how their life would transform, and then, oh, by the way, here's the tool to do that, and we're the only one that can do that. And I think that's really where, marketing becomes a big deal, because you do have to test. You have to like try new things, test what are the use cases, what are the channels. They're not going to be the same for everyone. And so I think that's really where the art kind of comes in versus
Mhm.
just here's the formula, go execute it. And so I think, again, whether you're in life sciences, you're in SaaS, you're in automotive, like it's the same thing of this idea of we do need to experiment to figure out what's really going to land. But it goes back to your point of you have to start with a strategic beachhead. It can't be for everyone, because then you're for no one.
Yeah. So maybe, Holly, while you were speaking about the drilling the hole and selling the bits and all of that, right? uh, is the following the new playbook that you're suggesting, right? I'm just going through my head. The first question is, go find out what's the audience searching for, right? So they're not searching for give me a quarter inch drill bit, right? They're searching for I want to do a quarter inch hole, right? So that's the problem, right? If they search on Google or Chat GPT or wherever it is, your website needs to essentially be able to go tell. And you mentioned about the education of it, which is your website and your solution should say that, hey, this is how you should be able to go do it. And and by the way, here's the drill bit and here's the drill that you can actually buy to go do that, right? So it's essentially pitching the problem first and not the solution first.
100%. You
Is
have
that
to lead with
is
the
that the framework that
problem.
you're suggesting?
Yes, I think it doesn't matter, again, the industry. You have to basically instantly, the first 10 seconds, someone has to instantly say, I've seen this thing, whatever, it's a TV commercial somewhere online or, reading in a magazine, whatever. In 10 seconds or less, they have to instantly be able to put it into one of those three categories: must have, nice to have, or don't care. I work from home, so like I don't really care that much about having a hybrid car to save money on gas because I don't really drive very much, So for me, I don't really care about the new car commercials. But that's what people don't understand is instantly you're going to put it in one of three buckets. And so if you can't educate them to self select, that's me, then they're going to just move on. Then when you hook them, if you will, then you can explain all the great things and the data and the rationale, blah, blah. But you got to give them that emotional hook first. And a lot of companies think they're buying the technology, they're buying the spec sheet. They're actually not.
Yeah, so maybe, I think that's a great story if you're the only one in the market. I know you mentioned, a couple of times about, the market is getting crowded, right? Let's take the same example of the drill bit and the hole. If someone's, let's say there are a million people who are searching for, I need to go, have a quarter-inch hole, right, on my drywall. How do I do it? And if there are 500 products in the market which can actually achieve exactly the same thing, how do you stand out? What would be your good marketing brain tells you on how to advise as founders, and most of our audience as founders and growth leaders? How do you advise them to stand out, to differentiate, and to being able to go sell your product out there?
It's a great question. And I'm so glad you asked because again, I think we need innovation, right? We need new solutions. So I want all companies to be successful. I think the playbook, if you want to call it that in almost every market you can imagine, there's usually one company that captures the economic value. Research shows it's one company captures 76% of the market share, which means that whether you have one other competitor or 700 competitors, everyone's really just fighting for scraps, right? Of that 24%. And so there's going to be one winner, and that's the reality. So how do you become the one winner, right? I think what's interesting is when it also varies as the market matures. So, in the early days of a new category, you're gonna maybe be a little bit different, or the first mover, or some, it's you or nobody, frankly. But if that category you're creating, that solution you're creating has value, guess what? Others are going to want to come into that space, right? Into that category. They're not dumb. They're like, I want a piece of that pie. And so category maturity takes anywhere from, call it, 3 to 8 years, depending on the industry, but that's kind of the average on a whole. And what happens over that time is more people enter the market, right? And at some point, what they call a dominant design gets chosen by the market, and that becomes the default. And so the idea in my mind to tell founders and innovators is, one is what's the urgent problem for a specific audience that only you can solve? And two, then the question is, how do you go ahead and develop and evolve the category so you can maintain your position, because people are going to come, and that requires evolution, right? You can't just make one product and be like, that's it, we're going to be the best forever. And so I think it's making sure you evolve, but also one fatal flaw a lot of companies make is they try to go after too big of an audience. They think, well, everyone who drives a car, for instance, everyone has a computer, everyone has a business, whatever that world is going to want this. As we've already said, there are segments where the problem you're solving is more acute for them. And
Yeah.
so I would really encourage people to find a niche and dominate that niche, then get bigger. And so if you are in a market or have entered a market and it's a battle, I would encourage you to try to find or niche down to a segment that truly has a problem they care about that you can uniquely solve, and then, own that, and then find ways to incrementally expand. And we've seen that in a lot of different places. You start with one thing, and then, you find a way to become more mainstream. It's the whole, Jeffrey Moore's adoption curve. You have your innovators, your early adopters, your early mainstream, and then eventually becomes, kind of more mainstream. Then you have your laggards. And that's just a technology adoption curve we've seen, in every industry. But I think the truth is like there is a blueprint depending on if you're the first, first person, if you're a fast follower, if you're, an incumbent, like there is a playbook you have to use, but it really goes back to what's the problem someone cares about that you can uniquely solve.
Got it.
Or you just or you're just going to be in a battle on features and price, and that's a race to the bottom.
Yeah. And when you mention niche, you're mentioning a very specific kind of an audience, right?
Yeah.
That's what you mean by niche.
Yes.
So I
Yeah.
think to the listeners, here's a great story from Monday.com. They were essentially a project management tool during the Jira and the old days where you can actually go build a project management tool. They found a niche with people who are running, who go to the churches and they create community service for them, who have smaller businesses. So they essentially created a product. And one of the best techniques that I've seen is they built web pages exactly for that particular audience. So they built, someone who's running a community service for churchgoers, there's a page for that on Monday.com. Someone who's running a small handyman job and who wants to maintain a list of to-dos and a list of that, they can use Monday.com, but there's a page on Monday.com/handyman, I'm guessing. So they essentially built a niche page, a landing page for each of their audiences. And I think they probably experiment with almost about 600 or 700 different niches. And from that, they found about like 10 or 15 of them that works. Listen to Holly. If you have not listened to Holly on this segment about the niches, that's where it is.
And I think to your point, it's because you make them feel seen. You make them feel recognized that you understand their problems better than anyone else, and therefore they believe you can solve the problem better than anyone else. And that's
Yeah.
what it comes down to.
Yeah. Yeah. So one last question I have for you, Holly, about somewhere I think I read about you writing or talking about learning velocity and adoption of your product has a direct dependency on how fast you can learn. You mentioned about experimentations. You mentioned experimenting with your messaging, your targeting, your use cases, your problems, your solutions. Maybe could you touch a little bit about what does that mean on learning velocity? I think most founders, most of our Thrivecast listeners, they think they are the best learners. They are learning AI. They are going after the customers. But you meant something completely different, which is learning velocity driving adoption. Maybe if you could throw some light on that.
Yeah. I think it's a conundrum a lot of companies face is they invest all this time and money and resources in building the product, right? That's where the investment, human capital and financial capital exists. And they put it into the market and they just expect the world's going to adopt it. And I think what a lot of companies are missing is that more human, element of let's really understand the market problem. And I think my one suggestion is one questioning what assumptions are you making about the market before you launch that you recognize may not actually be true. And again, a lot of companies think, well, this is going to be valuable, I'll just put it out there. And I think that's a real flaw. So I think the idea is the inflection point really happens when a company creates the conditions that make their product inevitable. And what I mean by that is you have to understand, is the problem urgent enough? Two, what are they going to have to reject? That's their status quo, right? Like again, like if I have an iPhone and you want me to switch to something else, what's going to make me do that? What's going to make my iPhone so irresponsible or so ineffective that I'm going to be switching? The third thing I think is the stakeholders. You made a comment earlier about who are the stakeholders, right? It may not be one person. It may be operations people, financial people,
Yeah.
regulatory bodies, all these things. You've got to give them a reason to change. And I think they have to be agreeing of that. And then I think it's this idea of what I call the narrative, which is you need to be teaching the market, conditioning them to recognize I have a problem. My life would be transformed if I did that. Here's the criteria for the solution. And then guess what? You're the only one that does it. And so I think it's this idea of getting your narrative to scale. But I think to your point, like simplicity is velocity. And I think also the velocity of that clarity is really what helps companies scale. And so it is a bit, of art and science, but I think a lot of companies over index on the rational science part of it, and they're missing the idea of human behavior and how to condition that so that they're primed for your solution when it's available, or if it's in the market, then you can scale that growth, which is really hard these days, especially in competitive markets.
Yeah, yeah. Maybe a fun question to end this with. Do you have any case studies, meaning you don't have to necessarily talk about the name of the customer or name of the prospect, if you will, who have done exactly opposite of what you have been recommending and they failed?
So many, sadly, like so many examples. No, I think it's interesting, because it'd be like if someone said, for most life sciences products, a device is about $100 million investment, and it's about a 10-year process. For a drug, it's almost 10x that, and even longer. So you're talking about ostensibly the biggest gamble of your company's life. And we're saying, here's your playbook to increase your odds and beat the odds of success. And they're like, we're good. We're good. And I think part of the problem is that healthcare is changing just like our world is changing, right? Like, things, dynamics are changing, innovation is happening, regulation is changing, geopolitical climate is changing, like it's very dynamic. And so even if you had a playbook that worked historically, it may not work now. And the second thing I think is that a lot of times customers, as you mentioned earlier, they just have so much blind faith in the technology that they think the technology alone will sell itself. And I think by the time you recognize that your forecast and your growth curve is stalling and maybe flatlining, you can't, the hammer, the nail on the coffin is there. And I
Right, right.
think there's just no runway. And so unfortunately, we have worked with clients that even though they went through the whole process, they still kind of ended up not executing, often because someone new comes in, they kind of, again, they have the better way, they think. But a lot of times we help companies course correct. They think, oh, here's a non-drug way to treat migraine, and everyone has a migraine should do it. But we had to come back and say, no, it's actually start with the child population. They're the ones that the parents don't want to give their kids drugs. So if you start on that beachhead, own that, then you'll figure out how to grow more. And they do. And so I think, again, there's good and bad. But I think a lot of times, unfortunately, companies wait too long and they realize there's a disconnect between what they believed and what the market believes. And I think that's what I think is kind of crazy to me, is that most companies think that business is about numbers, right? Your revenue, your EPS, your monthly run rate, your subscription rate, whatever. But numbers don't buy growth. Belief does. And what I mean by that is belief is contagious. It spreads faster than features, it compounds faster than revenue. And so that's the difference, I think, between companies that stall and companies that really, tip the world. It's not talent, it's not the capital, it's not the timing. It's, did they create belief in the market? Internally, you got to build it inside the walls of the company, but also in the market. And so I think that's really one of the most powerful forces in business, because once people believe, I think everything changes. And I think a lot of companies don't get there. Yeah, they
I
don't
think
get
that's a great soundbite as well, right? So I think, to all the listeners, I think, maybe if I can summarize, if I have understood what, Hall is trying to say is adoption really doesn't happen just because you got a better product or you have a better solution. It really happens when you're able to make the market change its belief system. Again, to all of the listeners, thank you for listening. If this episode has changed you on how to think about marketing, about your growth, about your adoption curves, and even challenge some of your belief systems, please do share it with someone who's actually building a product right now, and they probably need to hear all of this. And Holly, thanks again so much for joining us. I
Thank you.
really
And
appreciate
again,
all
I'm
the insight.
happy to be a sounding board if someone wants to bounce an idea off me. I'm on LinkedIn. I just, again, I want more and more companies to be successful bringing innovation to market that can have a positive impact. So I would love to support anybody.
Absolutely. And we'll have show notes and all the recording and anything else that Holly can share it with us. We'll add it to the show notes. Again, thank you all.
Yeah. Best of luck to everyone.
Cool.